Michelle?
Daniel, OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about our upcoming presentation in the month at Philosophy Portal, The Art of Storytelling, where we'll be talking about Under the Wing. So we're excited, and we just thought we'd jump on and talk about a little bit of it today. So part of the month will be interested in the connection, relationship between art and philosophy. So Michelle, what do you think about art, philosophy, literature, writing, all of those things? What comes to mind?
Well, I will say really quick, we'll be talking about Under the Wing at Thought Lab, the third event of the month. When I think about art and philosophy, I think about their inextricable nature. And I think about how much art and literature is, I want to say, enhanced when you look at it through the lens of philosophy, when you look at it through the lens of what are the concepts and the ideas that are there. I always remember my brother was taking this art history course in high school, and he took me and my twin sister to the art museum, and it was pretty fascinating, like walking around, like looking at these different paintings, and then, my brother just being like, so what do you think about this? And then, what do you think the artist was trying to accomplish here? What do you think, what kind of message do you get out of this? And it's like, an orange on a table with some shadow or something like that. And, then he kind of starts going off on, like, what it really means, And it was really funny. It was really funny. One of my most memorable times with my brother. But I say that all because what I loved about that experience, though, was, the fact that he was kind of taking his art history class and kind of bringing it to life with me and my twin sister. But that he was kind of thinking what goes beyond the visual, like what is beyond just the actual representation. There's something that is being represented, right? Now I was thinking about what you said on the fact that the story is the meaning, right? Instead of just being a meaning hunter, to see the story as meaning, as the meaning itself. And so I think what's really interesting is that, for me, there's something about sitting with that and realizing that there is something rather profound about it, where it's the fact that the form, it makes me think a little bit about McLuhan, like a little bit about the form, how it is the medium itself that presents the message and the meaning, really. And so, but I think you can only kind of get to that. You can only sort of see beyond, oh, that's a nice picture, oh, that's a nice story, which has its place. Hey, Raul.
Raul.
But to go beyond that requires the thinking about what is beyond the representation, or what informs the representation. So,
No, I think there's been a long history of, in the same way that philosophy has suffered, that has not gotten to the real or the material condition or the common life, and instead it's been like, how do we get beyond the appearance, right? Philosophy, theology has gotten in trouble to try to get to the essence beyond the appearance, versus in Hegel more of this idea that the appearance unveils the essence or is part of it, right? Well, there's also been in literature, and I'll just say literature because we're talking about Under the Wing, which you can sign up for the class on ogrose.com with Cadell and Holly and Payne. We're really looking forward to it. In the same way that philosophy has been hurt by this division between appearance and essence, so literature has been hurt by this story symbolism, story versus the meaning. And if we can get through the story to the meaning, then we get to the truth. And I think writing that has kind of carried the metaphysic that has been so problematic, in my opinion, in philosophy, has quite suffered for it. And, Flannery O'Connor, I always loved, where she was kind of like, if the reason why the misfit had a hat on his head is because, you put hats on your head. It wasn't a symbol. That's what people wear on their head. And you see also, too, what ends up happening is basically writers who become in this business of creating kind of a secret meaning. One, there could be something self-congratulatory about it. Oh, I know the secret meaning, and then the reader will have to come to me to find out the secret meaning. So there's almost a kind of framing yourself as a big other, kind of a power neurotic, kind of that sort of structure. And also it can be, writing becomes almost like creating a certain puzzle to be solved, right? And I'm not saying there's no fun to be had in some William, Gibson, some of these different works, or the recognizers, so on and so forth. But Writing, in the same way, if philosophy should really be in the business of trying to get to the real, or like really articulating a situation of something maybe we've looked at but never seen. I love that end of Waiting for the Barbarians by Coates Edwards, that the character says, I've been looking at something my entire life and I've never seen it. And I think one of the characters, there's this, they have like a burn mark in their eye. It's a little circle, and they can't see behind the circle and the burn mark in their eye. And I think, honestly, what ends up happening is that the human condition is way more defined by situations we're looking at and unable to see than we realize. And in fact, focusing instead on getting to the true meaning or getting to the essence behind appearance actually just functions in a way that keeps us from doing the work of looking at what we're looking at, of seeing what we're seeing, of being able to understand the situations we constantly find ourselves in relationships, in our own lives, our own mechanisms of self-deception and irony. And there is a whole lot of work to be done in literature, creative writing, etc., so forth, that is simply describing, really, really describing, almost like Cézanne or these great painters, really describing the situation we find ourselves in and doing it well in a manner that is going to help us really see even ourselves beyond our mechanisms of self-deception. And a lot of this focus on just creating symbolism or secret meanings or different things can get in the way of that articulation of the appearance of human condition, because the appearance is the truth. The appearance is where the real is found. And so I think there's a lot of that kind of thinking in creative writing that has been very problematic. But you see, here's, I guess, the other issue is one of the reasons, and I'll give it back to you, one of the reasons I think we've lost sight of the relationship between philosophy and literature is because we associate philosophy with, a lot of creative writing classes may, tell the students you have to choose, like David Foster Wallace was famously told, you have to choose between being a writer and a philosopher. And a lot of, creative writer people like, don't try to make your characters be these preachers of a philosophy or fill it with philosophical ideas that gets in the way of the story. That, I think, comes from a place, perhaps, of an intuition of the danger of turning a story into simply a symbol of something beyond it, where it's not about the story. But the problem is the target is misguided. It is a take on philosophy that creates a division between appearance and essence, if you will, and thus an appearance between meaning and story. And so you're saying, philosophy has nothing to do with story when you have that idea of philosophy. But then if you understand philosophy is actually the honoring of appearance, or that appearance unveils essence in a Hegelian sense, or that the truth is structured like a fiction, as Lacan says, well, then we can start bringing back the connections and bringing back philosophy and literature and conversation in a way that I think is actually very necessary for both of them. Certainly literature has suffered tremendously from its divorce from philosophy. But then we also have to understand philosophy that is not merely symbol hunting, which gets into people like I'm obsessed with the modern counter-enlightenment, various, psychoanalysis as well, phenomenology, that actually could bring that relationship closer. But that's part of the work that needs to be done, I think.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking a little bit about what you were saying, and I wonder if this is kind of important because the way in which meaning, the brain is going to look for a meaning for things, right? And I wonder if there's a way in which the arts, I'm thinking about Rookmaker's book right now, where there's almost this compulsion humans have to sort of create these representations, right, of life, and even way back to like cave art, and there's something about it where it has to meet, because it's sort of finding some meaning to existence, right? Yeah. That we then sort of try to put into these representations, and whether they're pictorial or verbal or in writing. But then there was also a kind of a time of like, no, it just is meaningless, right? It's meaningless, but we're going to still make art or representations, but it's going to be meaningless. Now you could say like, why are you making anything at all, right? If it's really meaningless, then why make it? But then this kind of return to the sense of, well, what if there's a way in which, because I was really thinking about that idea of like it being meaningless. But I think about like the encounter that I think our stories in a sense are trying to do. Like I think about Under the Wing, the title piece story in the collection. That's the last story in the collection. And I think there's something about the stories that there's sort of a hope that you kind of almost realize there's something that is necessary about going through the kind of crucible of what does this mean? Like, what does this mean? But that almost being hope, and not just like a nihilistic deconstruction. Though it will go through something that feels like deconstruction. So, because I guess I'm saying all this because I know that for me, in terms of experiencing life and the kind of proclivity to want to write and make stories out of life, because we often do that too, right? Like you're saying, like the Lacan quote, right? I always thought it was fascinating how symbols seem to present themselves already. Like just, and I don't know if it, was it a symbol hunting thing, or is it just the fact that our brains do this thing where they sort of categorize and they try to make sense of it. But I also thought it was, there is something, I guess I'm pushing on that because it's like, well, it could just sound like, oh, where there's no place for symbols and meaning. And whereas I think those things do enrich things a lot, but they also aren't, they mean a lot to you, but they also could just be meaningless to another person. But I mean, I think that's why I've always liked, wordplay, because it takes words and plays around with them and gets silly to the point where you realize, oh, I have to rethink this again. Not because you have the certainty of what the symbol means, so you can feel like, aha, I have that, I know the secret meaning, but because you don't know. And so therefore you engage with it in a playful manner that actually allows you a greater expansion of knowledge in a way, or maybe experiential and intellectual engagement with something that is, it feels like you're expanding in some way with that. So anyways, just wanted to share that.
Well, I mean, I think honestly this question has a lot of ramifications for many of the discussions going on in sociology or the meaning crisis or stuff like that, because there's $1 million question. Should a writer in a story try to create meaning, or show characters who already have meaning who are trying to live that meaning out? And those are very subtle differences that make a lot of difference. So, for example, a lot of the framing of the meaning crisis, and I think, this is not a critique of Dr. Vervaeke, but there's a question of the meaning crisis of, do we need to give people a new meaning? Or is it the problem that people already have meaning and they don't have the socioeconomic conditions to realize it? Or that they can't help but find things meaningful, and that's actually their torture? Because there are many sides to this problem. You can have the problem of having no meaning, which can be a problem. You can have the issue of having millions of options of meaning and none of them feeling authoritative. You can have the problem of having meaning but not having the time, energy to realize that meaning, to reference Dave. So meaning is a multifaceted problem. And the problem with an author, if they say, well, I have a particular meaning that I want to get across, is often that isn't going to be speaking to the human condition, because the human condition, one, is which we as human beings have to figure out our relation to which kind of problem of meaning relative to other human beings who have taken the problem from a different angle, and they all have to live together and get along, right? And showing that situation of the navigation of different takes on meanings or different relations on the problem of meaning and how to belong in that situation is a different framing. And to me, that, in our story Esperanza, which we'll read from in a little bit, there's that line in literature of show, don't tell. But of course, that can be very simplistic. And actually, we as human beings do tell one another different things. Yeah. But often we have no idea what we're talking about when we tell, or we're telling things to self-deceive or to avoid ourselves and so on and so forth. And what would it mean to show characters who are telling one another what they need to think in a manner that is pointing to something beyond just the mere telling, right? These kind of different chess games, I suppose, that can be played. And I think that's starting to get... And in that sense, literature, in a funny way, to save literature from symbol making can actually, in a sense, lift it to higher order showing, like proof, like showing of the entire human situation, which I think, honestly, by lacking those proofs, we can be less equipped to really have an understanding of what human beings are doing or how to understand one another. I think literature can function as literature can notably function as a very useful map by which to look at global pluralism or people of difference living with one another. But if people are too busy just trying to create a secret meaning, it might actually not have that higher order meaning structuring or meaning structure, you can kind of say. I mean, I would also say, just last and give it to you, Flannery O'Connor famously in that, what is it, Catholic in the South essay, talks about the reason why the writer doesn't need to create symbols is because reality is sacramental. Everything is already, quote unquote, a symbol, is already pointing to, for her as a Catholic, a divine reality. So the problem with symbol making is that you're doing something that is already done by reality. So your reality already points in a sacramental way. Everything points to something beyond itself. Things appear with meaning. Things manifest with meaning. So the problem with the writer who has a set meaning that he wants things to mean or be a symbol of, is you're actually then infringing upon the already inherent sacramental structure that things have. And that thus creates a contradiction.
Yeah, that's good. That's good, Daniel. Yeah, and I think that it made me think of Merton. And I was thinking about how he talks about symbols and how it's, it's just hard. We do tend to just think in a binary way. Oh, so we're saying meaning is bad then, right? Or, symbol are right. No, it's like this ablation of meaning and symbolism to say what is the case, right? And that's what I was saying, thinking about life and how it made it more alive was realizing that when you actually just, like you said at the beginning of our talk, right? When you actually just are describing what is the case, you realize, oh my gosh, that is the meaning and the symbolism that comes out on its own, right? And so, but it has to take a certain type of ability to see what is, the case, right?
Yes.
To see what's always been right in front of your eyes.
Oh yes, but that's also where, in the same way the philosopher in the ivory tower that doesn't have lived experience is in danger, so the writer who's in too many creative writing classrooms or who isn't going on and having experiences in the real world, they can be in danger because they haven't learned to train their eyes, right? If Proust is right that life is more about the kindling of new eyes than journeying to a destination, then there's quite a mysterious question of how one kindles new eyes. And that seems to have, a certain hunger to be able to see, to be able to know what you need to see or what you need to really study and look at. And I think that gets more at what the writer should think about, instead of the writer asking questions like, what do I want to say? What is the meaning? What is the ideas I want to get at? The writer needs to ask his or herself, what is the vivid situation that I really need to look at? What is it, the thing that's in front of me that I really need to see? And maybe it hits you at 2 a.m. and you see it in your mind, and then you're trying to hold it in front of you as you write. Like, what is the thing you really need to see and render into words? Which, of course, then as the writer sets you up to necessarily fail, because you're talking about bringing something. Writing, Cadell emphasizes correctly that there's something about, and look, subjective destitution. If humans do not go through subjective destitution, then there can be a lot of trouble that forms psychologically, emotionally, etc., so forth. In my opinion, writing in the manner that we are so describing brings with it a certain inherent subjective destitution, because you are attempting an impossibility. You are trying to put into words an experience. An experience cannot be fully brought into words, and yet not all failures are equal, right? Cadell has said, die better. Well, in writing, there can be a certain fail better, and I think that's another way where we can see philosopher and literature come together. Once we start seeing philosophy more on the side of the psychoanalytical, Zizek, that sort of thing that we discuss with Hegel and then counter-Enlightenment thinkers. And then we go, oh, wait, the practice of writing actually has a built-in failure structure, and yet not all failures are better. And for failing as such, you are developed differently as a subject in very important ways. Then I think you can further see how philosophy and literature can actually come together and it not be a threat to one or the other. Because there's just a long-standing bias, certainly in my opinion, for the last 30 or 40 years, where literature and philosophy should stay away from one another in people's minds. And there's some wisdom to that, Because most of the time when philosophy was brought to literature, it was for symbol making or hidden meanings or that
Propaganda.
stuff. That's correct, propaganda. But the point we're getting at is that that's not the whole of philosophy. There's a philosophy of the psychoanalytical, of appearance as a revealing of essence, of phenomena, and all of these different things. That actually is the kind of philosophy that I think without which literature dies.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's absolutely true, and I experienced that as well in, how people perceive and react, and as sort of how they feel out writing, and what it should be about. I think that as soon as it gets to literature that is trying to do this, like attempting to do this, and realizes it's like I said at the beginning, an inextricable nature with philosophy, sometimes people do get really like, but is that a fact? Like, is that a fact? If they read some portion or something like that, there's a lot of, wanting to, there can be a sense of well, that's too idea. That's too idea heavy, right? When really it's like you're saying, it's the experience trying to be brought to life in words, which is, again, like you said, an impossibility, but yet that impossibility can be what we need, right? Like that is, and I do wonder if there's something about just the nature of how things are learned, where it is usually compartmentalized like that. Like that's philosophy over there, and that's literature, and that's creative writing. That it's really not seen as able to be worked with each other. Like they're not able to. It's not able to be seen as something that can be braided together and woven together to make a stronger and more beautiful work. But I guess I just want to say that it is true that, in my own experience as well, there's a kind of aversion to writing that isn't maybe merely just sort of self-expression. And self-expression has a place for sure. But it's just that that's where you get, the funny thing about self-expression is that it can often do the work of the ego, right? And the ego does sometimes want to put out the meaning and the symbols that we're talking about in the unsublative sense. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that idea of this compartmentalized thinking is very valid. People say, well, they're different things and they shouldn't intersect. And if anyone has any questions about anything, please feel free. And again, that we're having a live because we're starting with a class, philosophy, a month with Philosophy Portal with Cadell, and we'll be joined by Pei and Holly, and you can sign up on the website. So we're talking about Under the Wing, which is a short story collection, and our thinking about relations between philosophy and literature.
Just really quick, I think too. The hope of good writing is not that it's going to be idea heavy in the sense of it, like you said, being a mouthpiece. The funny thing is, though, is that I think it takes kind of like sometimes it can take a type of development that is different in terms of its pace and cadence than work that is maybe not as interested in, or is let me say this, more interested in keeping those apart. So it's almost as if I do feel like ultimately there is a way in which even in trying to keep them apart, you can't help but have them sort of point to one another. But it's sort of interesting to think about that mindset of like, just write a story, don't let the philosophy creep in. I guess there's a part of me that's like, how do you not? Mm-hmm. You're still kind of, there is something that's being purported in that, right? That is, like, what I mean to say is it's a philosophy to keep them separate.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a similar question of, like, often the idea in science has been, don't bring in philosophy, just keep it, to the scientific experiment and so on and so forth. And the worry is a certain pollution that will occur, right?
Right, tainting.
The problem is that the scientists must bring in a metaphysic.
Yeah.
And by metaphysic, and metaphysic as a certain, what are the categories by which we are working with? What are the assumptions of reality? So, for example, a metaphysical assumption could be that wholes are made out of parts, right? Okay, nowhere in reality does the experience of things say to you that is wrong.
Right.
You bring that category, and therefore, by framing your experiments according to that category, you can believe that this will show, oh, reductionism is true, right? And, versus, say, a relational ontology of maybe Dr. Segal, Whitehead, et cetera, so forth, right? So you can't help but bring a metaphysic into your thinking, right? The question is simply, what metaphysics, and have you thought it through, right? So, likewise, the writer who doesn't think the metaphysical or the philosophical cannot help but bring that into it. And in some respects, one of the reasons the writer needs to think philosophically is precisely to be able to negate it. Like, actually, if you don't think philosophy,
exactly.
the problem is there will be philosophy in your work or worldview, and you won't be able to make it interesting.
And then it just gets dogmatic.
It just gets boring. Yes, and it gets dogmatic, and it becomes simply a personal expression. And there's nothing wrong with personal expression, but there's always a need for a certain bracketing of personal expression so that it doesn't ruin the quality of the work. Owen, in his class on Plato's elite pedagogy, which is tremendous, Owen in the Agon is a tremendous scholar, he was pointing out that, personal discussion is really important, but rather than just talking about, say, Plato's dialogues and, do you think beauty is, good or courage is good? When you understand the historic background of the particular characters that Plato is bringing into the dialogue becomes much more live and fascinating. And rather than just being an abstract question of, do you think courage is good? You see, Plato is choosing to have these characters who fought in this war and were kicked out of Athens for this reason in a discussion about courage. And that creates a kind of historic binding, if you will, or a certain historic framing for your personal discussion that makes your personal discussing way more dynamic, qualitative, and interesting. Because you then have to compare your personal expression and opinion with their personal lives and what they did, right? And to think, and so it makes it in a sense more democratic or more dynamic. Well, similarly, when you're aware of the philosophy that you're bringing into your writing, then you can make sure that it doesn't bleed over into all of the minds of all of the characters and then make them all think the same way. Because that's the other problem is often in philosophical discussion, as Owen was pointing out, if we talk about, say, courage, we can't help but talk about courage as if everyone thinks the same way about courage, because we naturally extend our understanding to everyone because we're stuck in our own heads. Well, in a similar way, that ends up happening to characters in stories when you're not aware of philosophies. You can't bind the philosophical opinions or the ideas because you haven't thought about the philosophy. So there's also an interesting paradox where if there is indeed a danger of philosophy in literature, that may, for people, be taken as reason not to think philosophy, but actually, in my opinion, it's all the more reason to think about philosophy, because otherwise it will actually infringe upon the work and bleed into it.
Yeah. And I think, too, again, there is a place for personal expression. In a sense, you're always going to be doing some personal expression, right? Because it's you as your own person expressing yourself in something you're writing or creating, right? But I think the issue is that if it's only personal expression as almost made the hierarchical, standard of what it means to write creative writing or fiction, you don't necessarily have to tarry with the negativity, like we talked about with Cadell in our talk. You don't have to tarry with the negativity because basically it's just going to be what you think and what you feel being cast onto the whole story, right? And I think that may not make you have to look at the things you don't want to look at, right? Because, it might. And it certainly, I think it's like kudos to the person taking the time to try to, effort to write something and bring something to life. But yeah, the risk is that there is you sort of disavow philosophy as you have a type of philosophy in your personal expression, which is really just sort of purporting what you already agree with or what you already feel comfortable in. Even if seems edgy and uncomfortable, you find a comfort in that too,
Yep.
Which is I think the point of the matter is when we talked with Cadell in our talk, which she had us on, which was great. It's really, to me, I think, the beauty of being cognizant of philosophy and literature's relationship is it can allow you to get uncomfortable And that's actually important. I think that's really important. And I think some of the literature that has most changed me is that which kind of grips you and makes you uncomfortable, but also not just to feel uncomfortable, because then you can get comfortable in your uncomfortability, being uncomfortable, but to really sort of get you to go beyond, right? To go beyond what you've already feel very certain about, and to push you, and to also see what it means that somebody else was gripped by something, the author, that is.
No, I mean, there's that, I guess, Glicksberg book on this idea that, so there are a few things, like, if your character voices ideas, you make sure as the writer that you don't agree with any of it. You necessarily create a certain distance between the ideas that characters are presenting and yourself, right?
Yeah.
Also, too, you make sure that ideas are presented as trade-offs versus, right and wrong, right? You also present ideas in stories where the characters themselves are basically burdened by the ideas, or tortured by the ideas, or trying to figure out what the ideas mean for them, right? That there is an idea, but the meaning is not clear, right?
Yes.
Ideas have to be an active component that is leading to the unfolding of the story, not simply just added to the story, that the story is an excuse to voice those ideas, right? Like, the ideas are actually characters themselves.
Yes.
And those are the ways which then, the problem is, if literature doesn't do that, since in people's lives ideas actually do have that effect, the stories actually aren't real to life. Because ideas are like this in our lives. Ideas do have this, we do relate to our ideas with confusion, or them having a certain impact on us, or wrestling with them. So if you have literature that doesn't have ideas in it, then it's no longer true to life. But if you have ideas in it, then there's the risk of the story being sacrificed for the ideas. So you have to figure out how to do those different tensions. And again, we're talking about Under the Wing, which is this short story collection that we worked on. Was it 2011?
Yeah, that's the start of our working on it.
OG Rose and started, and we sat in the back of Unoya and worked on those different things. So maybe we'll read.
Yeah, sure. Let's do it. We're gonna read a bit from Under the Wing.
Yep.
And again, we'll be discussing that at the third event of the Art of Storytelling at Philosophy Portal.
Yes.
But there's going to be great online events all month long.
Yep.
So yeah, we'll read from our story.
We will. Esperanza.
Esperanza. Okay.
So Esperanza. So we'll be reading again from Under the Wing. And this story is called Esperanza. Once upon a time, there was a girl who believed that if she confessed her love to her best friend, her life would leave her body. She would move on. This would cause her best friend great pain. And to save Artemio from hurting, Esperanza suffered the pain of never telling him how she felt.
In Havana, near the corner of Galeano Street and Café Archangel, under a setting sun, grime and dirt coated the tan point shoes and short black dress of a ballerina, standing in first position, her feet pointing in opposite directions, heels touching on the sandstone pavement. Esperanza lifted onto her blistered toes, and then held her arms out before her, raised them above her head, and fluttered her hands down to her sides to finish the port de bras. Wires drooped overhead, like the hanging gardens from nearby balconies. An 80s Mitsubishi with faded blue paint sputtered to a stop. Esperanza extended one leg out, then lowered it to step into fifth position, bent both knees, and picked up her front leg into a spin, the muscles of her golden brown legs bulging under her white and worn tights. Her black hair twirled around her like a long veil as she spun from her pirouette back into fifth position, one foot placed in front of the other, the toes of her front foot in line with the heel of her back foot. She performed an entrechat, jumping into the air and crisscrossing her legs in front and in back before landing, and reflected, smaller inside the black pupils of an old man with a beard who stood inside the cafe past the white window bars. The deaf man rested his fingers flat against his mouth and lowered his shaking hand in her direction, an offering for the miraculous sight of Esperanza's opal eyes. Esperanza jumped into a brise, beating her feet and legs together in the air before landing and repeating the move twice more. From fifth position, she transitioned up onto her toes to second position, completing an échappé. Then, with a step and point, she lifted her other leg straight behind her body. Her foot pointed toward the parked Mitsubishi. As if summoned, the driver climbed out and held his straw fedora to his chest. Esperanza stretched her arm toward the red sky, with her other arm behind and just above her leg, pointing toward the sidewalk. A kicked soda can clanged to silence when the bored teens saw the first and only arabesque of their lives. They would never learn its name. Esperanza lowered her leg and arms, stepped up onto both of her toes in soutenu, and, knees pulsing slightly, lifted her arms over her head and with many little steps completed a full circle in beret. She then pointed her right toe forward, her supporting leg bent in demi-plie, and began a fouette turn. She whipped her leg, bringing it around in retiré to touch her supporting leg, and when she had nearly come around completely, she whipped her leg again, then again, spinning, around and around. Cubans gathered to see the girl with the eyes that changed colors. She stopped, and with light steps prepared for a full split in the air, a grand jeté, believing she was fated never to be with the one she loved. Esperanza leaped.
And that is the opening of the story Esperanza, which you can find in Under the Wing, which we will be talking about this coming month at Philosophy Portal with Stygian Society, Pei and Holly and Cadell. And this is a story that we worked on. I suppose the first draft was 2014.
Yes.
Waking up at 5 a.m. and different things on it. And it is always interesting the different forms that a story goes through over the years and different things. And I think also when you originally write that sequence and having to think, what is it believable that a ballet dance move would transition into? And you think, oh, yeah, that would work. And then you go, no, that would not work. Michelle at reading is like, nah, that wouldn't work. That wouldn't work. And I think that also, too, is an important relationship between literature and philosophy, is in fact, like, what can happen in creative writing, I think, when you're really trying to get the sentences and everything to go together, is you really, 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 really thought that worked.
Yeah.
You really, really thought those ideas go together. You really thought those were good ideas. Yeah. You really thought that political project would save the world. You really thought, and it would not. And there's a certain, I think, continual deconstruction and humbling that occurs that I think is also very advantageous for philosophy. In the same way that we've been speaking to ways that philosophy is beneficial to literature, I think the practice of literature can be extremely valuable to thinking philosophy.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I think it is important that, when literature is actually just, when it's really not just, it's a huge thing to expose what is the case, right? What really is the case, and having that vision for that, it's true what you're saying, because then, literature can say to philosophy like that, those ideas don't actually work in actual lived experience, and then the philosopher can say, oh, that when you live out those particular ideas, those don't work. So in having that kind of dialectical relationship between the two, it's really important, And yeah, I mean, I think I loved working on Esperanza, and been doing ballet for many years. It was great to be able to come and think about what this is actually going to look like, what this can actually be. And I think it's funny for that story in particular, because there's kind of there's a technical dimension to really kind of getting it, getting the movements right for this ballerina, right? This ballerina Esperanza, who's on the streets of Havana in Cuba. And, there's this accuracy in reading through those terms and those French words and everything like that. And it makes me think about what throughout our stories, we're looking at this concept of show, don't tell, right? Show, don't tell. And yet she's doing a show, the show of her body and her movement and her ballet, and we're reading it through the lens of these words, right? These pieces of movements, and in some ways, for those who don't know ballet, right, and don't know the French terms, all you'll know is that I think she's doing some sort of ballet routine here. But I think that's important, because there's an experience of, I want to say that even a bit of frustration, that I think is important, actually, in reading through something that is a bit more technical. Like the flow of it for me is there as well, though. So it's like the frustration and the flow, where you can read something that has a flow of intentionality, but there's also the realization of, wow, we have words.
Yeah.
we're kind of that's in a sense all we have, to be able to understand. And so I think that's important. I think it's important that the phenomenology of the reading of that section in particular is that way.
Well, I mean, the irony of show don't tell is you have to tell the thing you're showing. And so also the irony is you can't write a story without having some sort of world that's coming into view, ergo worldview, right? So that, that story is a lot on this tension, you could say, between philosophy and literature. And also, too, there's a tension between if there is no ballerina terminology that's being used, there's a certain lack of realism, because this is the kind of language that would be used by this character in this way, right? But the language has to be used simultaneous with enough a description of those moves so that the reader can have the image of the move in their head, even if they don't know the term, right? Which then, of course, comes back at the end when terms are dropped. And so you always have that judgment of the mean. Well, again, in Aristotle with ethics, basically the ethics of the human being is completely dependent on a perpetual judgment of the mean, which is not the middle, but the fittingness, right, in order to create the effect. Well, another way that I think creative writing works with philosophy is precisely as a regular habituation of the judgment of the mean. Oh, this wording works, this wording doesn't work. Oh, it's more Celine than blue. Oh, this is too technical, this isn't technical enough, and this judgment. And I think also as the writer, you never know for sure, which is, again, the truth of the human condition. You never know for sure. And that experience of never knowing for sure and actually having to write that nevertheless, I think is actually very important for the philosopher, because if the philosopher says, I know for sure, writing this, like the philosopher that writes from a knowing versus an unknowing, is going to give you bad philosophy. In the same way that the writer who is never having to make judgments of the mean, they just go all in on simple or all in on technical. There's no judgment of the mean. Well, it's going to be bad, right? Mm-hmm. So there's always a certain, in my opinion, in writing, there's always a certain risk, because it's more like cooking, and the taster of your food is not immediately available to you, and ultimately you can only get but so much feedback, and then you ultimately have to make the leap, the move, right? I think good philosophy does the same thing. Like, it's always keeping its eye on the fact that whatever is philosophized will come back to a human element, a human judgment of a mean, a human situatedness that a risk is taken in, that courage will be required for handling. So likewise, in the same way, like I think in writing, another key is that writing that deals with philosophy always has to come back to a subject, always has to come back to an Esperanza, a Mary Rose, an Eve, and that the thinking is coming back to the subject. Well, that's no different than Hegel's psychoanalysis. It all comes back to a subject, and philosophy can never replace the subject. Likewise, the idea of the literature can never replace the situation of the characters. It can never replace the characters. It can never be over the characters. And ultimately, the characters will have to make a decision. They will have to make a choice. A key concept in our work is an absolute choice. Well, you as the writer is also, in a sense, making an absolute choice when you finally decide, this is the mean, this is the judgment. But then when you're rewriting stories for 10 years or so on, you're always rethinking and retraining and situating. But in the same way, Esperanza, in trying to show Artemio without telling him, how she feels. Can a dance show someone you love them if you never tell them that you love them? Can a dance ever communicate that without words? Right? Is that even possible? Because if it is not possible, then what are we talking about when we say show, don't tell? What exactly are we showing? The show that is never talked about is very different from the showing that is, right? And what are the limits of showing without words, right? But of course, what are the limits of words without showing? What are the limits of literature without philosophy? But of course, what are the limits of philosophy without literature? And I think the limits are vast. But then, of course, to not fall into those dangerous limitations, one has to bring them together, and bringing them together is risky because you can infringe upon them and blend them and blur them versus have them dialectically relate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think too, really quick, I was thinking about how it is funny, right? Because show don't tell is usually said by, an English teacher or like a creative writing teacher or something like that, which is understandable. But what it's kind of revealing is the fear that can happen, like we were talking about at the beginning, right? Where it's show don't tell people too much, right? Don't like, it's almost like don't make it obvious. But then what you're really saying is almost like to paint a picture for people, set up a scenario, set up a type of environment, right, where people can feel it, where you don't have to tell them she's sad, he's sad. So I think that it's valid advice. It's just that it also has the tension of you're still using words, right? You're still going to tell something. So what exactly are you telling, and it's almost like story, and that's what's funny with the art of storytelling. Like I'm thinking about just the wordplay there, right? Show don't tell, but it's almost like show is telling. Like, it's like, oh, that's very telling that it would be this way. So I think that that's almost more of what the hope is in writing, is to be able to do that. But yeah, nevertheless, there's that tension that you just spoke about, and it is interesting how maybe another aspect of doing the show don't tell is to create the psychological experience, like this, or get into the psychology of the character. Now I think writing is a particularly interesting medium because it has some pretty strong limitations, but it also has its advantages. But I'm just thinking about other forms, where backstories or narrate, or like understanding, seeing what's in the characters' heads can be more able to be communicated. But I think we have feared that a lot because of like, oh, don't tell, right? Mm-hmm. But then you don't always get the like kind of the slow sometimes build up that is required, like the psychology of what's actually happening, that is so necessary to actually, like I was saying, paint that picture or create that environment, to be able to feel it yourself, to be able to feel what's happening yourself.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, I mean, literature as a medium, one of the things that it can do is the first person narrative, or the voice in the head, or perspective focalization. There's different things. And so literature that's not going to do that shouldn't be surprised if it's replaced by movies. Because movies as a medium can more effectively just show action or romance or whatever. But the written word on the page can integrate action and voice in head and interpret and move between a conversation with a person, a conversation in the head, and so on and so forth, which I guess a Terrence Malick film or something like Tree of Life might be. I think he tries to bring the voiceover into film. I will let other people decide if that works or not. I do like his movie Badlands, but it's Badlands early. But anyway, literature is uniquely situated, in my opinion, to actually draw attention to the voice in the head, and also how we as subjects wrestle with ideas. So if literature doesn't talk about ideas or employ the voice in the head in psychoanalytically interesting ways, or ways that are really getting at issues with vast stakes, then again, literature is just setting itself up to be replaced by movies and shows, and it shouldn't be surprised if it is so replaced. I think also with Show Don't Tell, a play in Esperanza, and again, we're talking about Under the Wing, our short story collection, because we have a month at Philosophy Portal with Cadell. And that starts tomorrow, and you can sign up on the website. But the idea of Show Don't Tell, the play in Esperanza, is that romantic advice? What does it mean to show, don't tell? Oh, show someone you love them, but never tell them that you love them. That doesn't work very well, actually. And so if that doesn't work well in romance, why would it work well in fiction? And it probably, whatever fiction is thus wrote will probably not be of great passion. It probably will be not something that compels people. So this idea of show, don't tell, sure, there's this idea of telling someone you love them without showing to them is problematic, but showing them that you love them without ever telling them, how would they ever be able to see it as love, right? And so there's also an issue where literature that doesn't have ideas, it's probably the most philosophical it's going to be is whatever the zeitgeist is, whatever the philosophy is in the air already, right? That's what you'll be able to show without telling, because people already know it from the TV or just know it from their daily life. So the kind of philosophy literature we'll discuss in the show don't tell paradigm will be very captured by the logic of capital or situated by the zeitgeist. Well, if literature wants to open up new ideas or new thinking, then we'll have to somehow figure out the mean between showing and telling to actually expand the horizon so that things that are shown is beyond what you're being told on the media or by your neighbor or in the air.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was also thinking about how there's also the trickiness of our own the inner subjectivity of every human being, right? Where so somebody could say, I love you, but you'll always have that question of, do they really mean it, right? Do they really mean it? Now, I guess the theory goes, if you show it, if the person's going to show it, then, it gets confirmed. So then when they say it, they also mean it, because they mean it because they're showing you it, right? Yeah. But it is interesting how there is something about how, and we've talked about this extensively, where it's like, all we do have our words between each other. I mean, we also have actions and how we treat one another, of course, but when you say something, when somebody says something, you kind of have to believe that they mean it, and trust them that they mean it, right? And maybe the sad and hard reality of human experience is just that people have felt that have been put in positions where it was clear, or it became clear that the person didn't mean it. Right. And so then it's like, how do you regain an ability to sort of trust in the word itself again?
Yep. But that's where it would get interesting, when the relationship between showing and telling breaks down. Right. What do you do then? What that's the kind of thing that literature can be good at, not merely a reification of showing, not telling, or philosophy that's really telling without showing. It is about the breakdown between those things.
I mean, that's why I've always enjoyed Chekhov's plays, because I feel like he does a great job of showing how, and a lot of the Russian literature will do this, especially when it comes to, the marriage relationship or the love relationships, where people, they're clearly saying something, but they're doing another thing, and so when you start to hone in on that, you start to realize, well, wait a second, how do we get that right? How do we get the showing and the telling correct? Especially too, when people have, as you were talking about with science, have different hermeneutics and interpretation of words. So, it's almost as if there's something that has to be underlying it all that can inform the both to be able to correspond well to one another.
Yes.
Some type of a, metaphysical
basis, well, you have to think that. The situation, the metaphysics, the philosophy, right? Yeah. If something breaks down, in order for that not to break down the work, there has to be something supporting it, right?
Yeah.
But you have to be able to think that situation and what supports it, right? And what's indeed going to do that. But that gets into where philosophy is part of the storytelling. It is actually a mechanism and tool of the storytelling. It allows the story to develop in ways that otherwise could not, because it is able to provide additional backgrounds or supports or directionality to take the story in interesting ways that it couldn't go in without it, because it would just be bound to having to maintain show, don't tell. It wouldn't be able to play with breaking it down or experimenting with it in new ways. And it certainly couldn't start opening up new horizons. So I think, ultimately for me, that basically just suggests that the future of storytelling, the kinds of stories we can tell, is deeply impacted by how much philosophy we can think. And if you're not allowed to think philosophy, don't be surprised if your stories are repetitive, limited, or not very interesting. I mean, in my opinion, we should also just note, most of the works that are still popular are science fiction or fantasy. Well, science fiction is going to be more able to simply create new worlds that are interesting, right? It's going to be able to just imagine a kingdom that doesn't exist, right? But if you're dealing with literary fiction, which means we're not going to create a scientific world or a fantasy world, we're going to tell a story about a family in Georgia.
Right.
Well, how do you make that new and invigorating, right? How do you make that alive? Well, most people are doing it through a personal experience or personal expression or romance or whatever. Well, the only way you could do it is philosophy, because philosophy allows you to add something new to the already, which is going to be really the only way that literary fiction is going to be able to kind of be alive and new.
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah,
science
yeah.
fiction can just imagine a new world, right?
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of the escapism to that, right? You escape to that. You escape to, and that's why people enjoy it. And there's nothing wrong
Sure,
inherently with that. But and maybe people just say like, well, I like those tropes, you know. I like,
Sure.
I like the repetitive nature. I know what I'm like. It's kind of like, you know, why somebody would use a chain restaurant, because they know what they're going to get, right? They know what they're going to get, so they'll just go there versus like just trying to
Sure,
pull
but
the
then
Waffle.
literature is just a consumable good, right?
Yeah,
and fine,
it's
you know, that's great. It's just logic of capital.
But yeah, with I think what's important about, you know, esteeming the alternative to the consumer reading, right, is because it has the potential to help you
Yep.
like not in a self-help way, but in a sense of like it has the capacity to change your life and to change the way you see, you know, your life in Georgia, like you're saying, right? And that's important. That's necessary because we do require that as humans, or we seem to require it because we often find ourselves having to rethink and figure out a way to sort of deal or see things in a new way. Or if we realized we could live differently.
Yes,
know?
that's correct.
Yeah.
If you can't see, literary fiction can help. It should, in my opinion, help you learn to see the world you're living in new ways. You're not so bound to your immediacy, right? But that is going to require philosophy. That's going to require that kind of thinking, and otherwise, what ends up happening, well, without philosophy in this way, I don't think it's by chance that the most like, it all goes more in the direction of science fiction, fantasy, and stuff like that, because that's how you get the newness, right? But if we're doing literary fiction, then you're going to require that philosophy to actually see a real situation in a new way. And a lot of times, if people are having trouble in marriages, relationships, work, a lot of the problem is an inability to see it differently.
Yeah.
Right? And literature can actually show ways to do that, or can help think different ways, right? Philosophy can too, but it's really hard without story to bring that philosophy into a lived experience by which to connect it with the lived.
Well, I mean, it's so true. I'm to playing devil's advocate. Somebody might just be like, well, that's all good and well, Daniel, but I could just perpetually escape. And I do think that more and more technologies are making it possible to perpetually escape. I've been learning more about virtual reality lately. That's a tangent, but and I'm thinking about how wild it is. Some of the inventions that are like on the horizon, and you know, basically worlds that people can basically inhabit more than they inhabit their own physical spatial location. And you know, maybe people are like, well, we'll just do that. In my opinion, the fact of the matter is you're still going to need to use the bathroom. You're still going to go to bed. You're still going to need to eat. You're still going to like have relationships in your life with physical human beings. And all of those things are really what are real, you know? And so anyways, to me, I think it's like, it is so necessary. It's so crucial to have tools by which to combat our human propensity to never want to see things differently, and to never want to, you know, change our perspective or try things differently, or again, it comes a lot from seeing things differently because of ideas, right? So what are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, without robust, dynamic literary fiction, then virtual reality becomes very difficult to not go toward. It almost
like
is.
There's no defense. Like, why wouldn't you?
I mean, basically, a lot of the battle, if you will, for the human is on grounds of what is the character or quality of the fiction by which we are going to habituate ourselves. Like, humans will live with fictions because truth is structured like a fiction, and because the map is not the territory, and we cannot handle the whole at once without being overwhelmed. So the relation between truth and fiction is not false. Fiction is the necessary approach to truth. It is the way truth must come forth so that we can relate to it, right? So the question is not, is there going to be fiction or truth? The question is, what kind of fiction will be around? And where literature, in my opinion, has failed to offer dynamic and compelling fiction, then people look for the virtual, and they get their fiction from the virtual. So the virtual reality is what is kind of filling in the void left by a lack of robust literary fiction. And you could also say the problem is with, say, fantasy or science fiction and literature, that is not helping you deal with the ability to see the real in new ways, right? Because ultimately, one will give into the pull of technology if they don't know how to make the real world in which they are living appear to them differently. If they're not able to see life differently.
Yeah.
That's the kindling of new eyes Proust is talking about. That comes from philosophy. That comes from literature. That comes from encounters with stories where you actually can see situations differently, right? So, Ivan Illich, we talk all about the time with Illich on this choice between the extension of humanity versus the replacement of humanity, convivial technology or manipulative in and lose ourselves, or technology that helps extend us, right? Well, the likelihood of using technology in a manner that replaces humanity becomes much higher if we're not equipped with the capacities to see reality in new ways, and that's what good literary fiction can teach us. But if we lack good literary fiction, then the pool of virtual reality and the digitization of reality. Because another way to look at it, if Charles Taylor is talking about the loss of enchantment, right? Like the modern world, enlightenment, there's a loss of, in the secular age, talking about the loss of enchantment. There's a way in which the making things digital or the augment or virtual reality is a sort of way to return to enchantment.
Yeah.
But it's a certain counterfeit to it as well, because you're not actually enchanting. You're not actually making reality enchanting again, or making it alive with philosophical form, per se. You're just replacing it. Yeah. You're just covering over it with a digital expression, right? But the challenge today, the choice today is not between truth and fiction. The challenge today is between what kind of fiction through which truth will be filtered.
Yes.
And if we don't have robust literary fiction, then, it's just going to be virtual reality.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And I do think there is something about the hope of literary fiction is to help bring back that sense of seeing and establishing oneself in their isness, right? Yep. In their isness.
No, absolutely, and I see we have very little battery.
Suddenly my 60% battery.
It's amazing how that happens. But so again, we're talking about Under the Wing.
Yes,
the short story collection,
which we wrote together, and it will be really wonderful to be able to discuss it further at Thought Lab, which will be the third week of May, part of an online series of events at Philosophy Portal, all circling the concept of the art of storytelling with Cadell Last and with Holly Rhiannon and Pei Vio. We're really excited about it.
We are very excited about it. It will be a thrill to be part of it. Yes. And we'll close. There's a poem in the story.
Also, really quick, if you'd like to purchase our book, you can find it on Amazon. Yes.
So you can find it on Amazon, and you can sign up for the class on our website. Yes. To close, Stretched. The trees of the Santa Monica Mountains were charred annually, suggesting summers frustrated were dragged on invisible wires into bright places with bright faces, an hour from Hollywood. Encircled by burned and bark-skinned lines, the heaven reachers which sustained life on the planet and never knew when to quit. Eventually they just fell. We hiked into a clearing for stress relief from auditions and found a lone wing with burned-out feathers. From your shrugging shoulders, the stuffed book bag, gear-filled, slipped and disturbed the hard ground, and I chuckled about how children only ever wished for wings. In the ash, you fell to your knees, cupped the wing in your hands, and, just like now, lived in expectation. OG Rose will be at Philosophy Portal for the month of May, and we're looking forward to it. And thank you for joining us this evening.
See
We
you
have
down there,
enjoyed
Drew.
it.
Thank you, Drew.
And thank you all, Drew, everyone. We
Yeah.
really appreciate you taking the time. So thank you all, and have a lovely evening, Drew. Pleasure. And thank you all again. This has been From Under the Wing by OG Rose, and have a good night.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye, everyone.